Welcome to the map-making starter guide for Starcraft Brood War. I'm Pernogo, a veteran mapper who's been working on this game for way too long, over 20 years, and today I'm going to walk you through my thoughts and philosophies on what a map is actually made of and how you can make your very own maps. Why should you, yourself, be interested in making a map, I hear you cry out? Well, map making has never been better than right now. And like I said, I've been working in this game engine for 20 years, which is way too long and makes me sound way too old. That all being said, it is still something that lends credence to my theory. If I say it, and I've seen this game come and go in terms of the tools that are available, then hopefully it holds some water. That all being said, SCMDraft is the map-making tool of choice, as far as I'm concerned. Of course, we also have a bunch of mod support for not just this tool, but in general. And on top of that, not only is your toolkit the best it's ever been, and the environment the best it's ever been, but it's a great gateway into modding and making more robust projects, while also being something that pretty much anybody can start doing. The barrier of entry has never been lower, and the heights that you can achieve have never been higher. So I hope that that is enough of a convincing statement to make you, just consider the option of jumping in and making some maps. So we need to first go over some basic definitions. But before we get really deep into the guide, I should note that if you're already somewhat versed on map making specifics or basics, you might just want to skip ahead to when I actually start mapping, or maybe some of the theory about when I start laying out my opinions on my philosophy on what a map actually is and the anatomy of stuff. You might find that stuff a bit more interesting. This next bit is more for the people who are brand new to the idea of making maps in StarCraft, or maybe have thought about it. Maybe they've opened up StarEdit a few times, maybe even SCMDraft a few times, but they consider themselves pretty much beginners and just want the full sort of lowdown. So that's what I'm going to be giving you guys here. One of the main things that I need to stress is that no guide on map making is ever really complete, because map making itself is a creative enterprise. It's a creative act, and you can't really follow a script to come out with maybe something like a feature complete project. Yes, you can, but something that's uniquely yours, not really going to happen. So take everything that I say here with the understanding that while it works for me, you might find a different method is more suitable for you. I still encourage you to try out everything that I'm going to do in this video, because it's worked for me, and I've obviously had a lot of experience in this matter. But if you find something that you think is a little bit better, or just better for you, or more interesting for you, you want to take your maps in a different angle, a lower or higher scale, or have some different characteristics, that's totally fine, and it's actually expected that people would experiment a little bit, especially if they're just starting out. Really, all I'm trying to do in this video is give you guys a bit of a head start, because I've been, like I said, working in this for over 2 decades. If you can learn some of the lessons that I've had to learn very painfully through mistakes and wasted time, then hopefully that saves you a couple of headaches down the line. Of course, we're going to be talking about how to use SCMDraft, as well as, of course, making our very first melee map in this tutorial. So just bear that in mind as we get down the later stages of this. This hand-holding portion is probably going to be the least interesting, but it's still very important if you're new to the concept. Not only that, but if you also consider that this being the very first video, I do have to go over a lot of concepts, and I promise the later videos will also just in general be a bit better, because we'll be able to get straight into the thick of actually making maps as soon as we start off here. Now, the other couple of questions that I have, or major points that I have to sort of answer here, is why I've chosen this map that's in front of you guys right now as the main map that I'm showing off initially. And it's actually a bit of a bait and switch. You see, I come from a CSGO background as well, and in Counter-Strike, there's a video, I wish I should have done the prep to actually know where this video came from, but there's a video where he's trying to teach people how to use sniper rifles in that game, and as a part of the bait and switch, he throws the sniper rifle on the ground and picks up a regular automatic rifle and says, before you learn how to snipe, you need to learn how to use a regular rifle. I thought that was a really good bait and switch. I'm going to use the same tactic here. Before you can make a map like this, where it's just asymmetrical warfare and it's like a scenario free-for-all campaign, all of the normal rules are just thrown out the window and it's completely asymmetrical in that respect, you should learn how to make a real melee map. I say a real, like a conventional melee map. And that's what we're looking at here now, is a more conventional, more symmetrical melee map. Now, there's a couple of caveats that I'll give later on when we talk about symmetry in this game, but in general, this is going to be so much easier for you to grasp if you're new, or if you're trying to maybe go back to the basics and figure out where maybe some of your predispositions are lying to, because ultimately, StarCraft is an RTS that's meant to be played competitively. And if you can't make competitive ready maps, if you don't understand what makes a competitive ready map, then you are not going to be very well equipped to make that kind of content going into the future. And you're going to have to unlearn a lot of bad habits, which is exactly what happened to me and why it took me almost 20 years to make anything worth looking at. So again, bearing that in mind, and hopefully I can get you guys to that level a lot sooner than I had to, we're going to jump into this momentarily. The other thing that I want to mention is, aside from starting with melee maps in your quest to understand content and map making, you should also start with smaller maps. Brood War map making is actually quite easy to get something like finished and to a point where you can at least play it, even if all the details aren't there, you haven't put all the custom terrain or the doodads and all that stuff, you haven't made it super pretty. You can get a quote unquote gray box where you're just using like basic textures. You're not worried about looks and details in probably under an hour for a fairly large sized map. In fact, that's what happens with a lot of my content. So I can get something super quickly developed to a point where then I can start play testing it. And even though it's far from what the final product will look like, it might not be that far from what it plays like. And that level of interactivity, as soon as, again, the barrier of entry being so low, that level of interactivity with your project before it's even properly finished is basically unheard of, especially in like 3D map making spaces. So that's another reason why it's really easy to get into map making, because within about an hour of setup, you can actually start working on your map, and very soon after that, test it with AI or just by yourself, trying to like line up buildings and figure out, build orders and stuff, if that's your thing. And that's obviously something that can help out quite massively in your motivation, because if you can immediately test something that you're trying to change, becomes a lot easier to stay motivated to work on the project, just because you don't have to like put it down and, wait like a week before your map is ready for testing. So based on all of these different factors, a smaller melee map is basically the most constrained element that you can be in and still make a functioning map that's competitive ready. So that's what we're going to start with when we get into the map making section. And the reason why that's so important is because we're basically using the strictest rule set we can imagine, constraining as many of our creative natures as we want and as we can. And as a result of that, we're going to be able to take those training wheels, as they were, off as these series continue on. So the next video, for example, will be a larger melee map, and after that we'll go into asymmetric maps and, essentially get a little bit crazier. For now, we're just going to stick to this because, again, I believe that this is going to help teach you guys really the core lessons of map making in a way that's probably the best way that I can come up with. At least it's the best idea that I've had in order to articulate some of these subjects. So let's get into some definitions, and I'll use this latest melee map that I've made, Parabola, in the Twilight tile set. I'll use this as a bit of an example here. I think a map can be boiled down to a couple of key elements. The first are assets, and this is what you see in most areas of the map that are worth paying attention to at a very quick glance. Assets are literally just what they say on the tin. It's like an expansion. It might be like a high ground area that you can hold with just a couple of units. It's a strategically important area of the map that can be utilized to secure victory over your opponent. Now, if you really want to play fast and loose with definitions, you might be able to define literally every square of the map as an asset, but for the sake of it being useful, I would, essentially be strict about just calling it like that when you've got like a bridge, for example, that can be easy to hold, or you've got obviously an expansion like we see here, or something like this where there's this high ground area. This isn't really like the same thing as some of the later terms. It's very clearly meant to be this small, constrained space where a little bit of gameplay can go a long way. A little tiny interaction can be a big swing in terms of a battle. That's essentially what we're going after here. We go on from that and we talk about pathways. Pathways are what you would think this bridge is on its face. In reality, the pathway is much larger. It's actually from this red start location down the ramp and then across the bridge. Now, notably, this bridge is also a bit of an asset in that it's a strategically important, location or whatever. But for the most part, it's also a pathway, right? If you can trace the pathway here, and this is actually something that I do while I'm like talking subconsciously, I just started like tracing the pathways. I'm not sure why, it's probably autism, but if you're really interested in like making sure that your pathways are easily intuited, that's something that you might even be able to utilize to your advantage. You might just move your mouse around like this and you see where the pathways are, where the army rotations are probably going to come in. Particularly smaller army rotations across pathways essentially are almost conga lining in some cases. You want to leave enough room in your pathways in general. And that's why these bridges, for example, are so wide, and why some of the areas over here have a lot of space in them. And pathways connect assets to one another, but they also connect to the other thing that I would say. And if you watched my level design and Brood War video from a couple years back, this is actually new to this conception. That's courtyards. Courtyards are completely new in this terminology. And the reason why I've come up with them is because I needed a term that wasn't an asset, because it wasn't particularly strategically important for a battle. It was just an area where battles tended to happen and where large army rotations could be moved through. And as a result of that, that's where I came up with the term courtyard. You got pathways that connect you to courtyards. I would say this whole area with this basilica in the middle is kind of a courtyard that obviously has a couple of assets in it. This is where a large battle might take place. A large battle meaning something that might last from, maybe 30 seconds to a couple minutes or something, depending on how quick the time to reinforce is. And of course, we've got a symmetrical one down here. This obviously differs from a pathway in that it's much larger, it covers a much wider area, and it's not just like you go this way or the other way, going backwards, essentially. It's not as linear and binary as that. It's much more free form where you can go. So again, you can probably boil a lot of these elements down to their base parts and say, well, this courtyard is actually made of 3 assets and 4 or 5 pathways, but that doesn't really help you for understanding like what the use of them actually are. And that's where the asset and courtyard terminologies come into play. So hopefully that was, enough to get you up to speed with the kind of ways that I'm thinking about things. Now, just because we know what parts of a map can be called doesn't necessarily give us the equipped knowledge of what's necessary to really understand how to conceptualize a good map. I would say the key elements of any successful competitive map are going to be a functional core, which is basically just collecting all of these anatomical elements that we just talked about, and packaging them together where you can have functioning real-time strategy gameplay in them. Like there's no glaring imbalances or abuse cases in your terrain. The pathways are wide enough for large armies to stick through. You've got decent amounts of assets to the point where you have enough expansions to expand to or to contest if they're in the middle or in some unsafe terrain, that sort of stuff. As long as you can have enough RTS gameplay to essentially have the space to experiment and come up with your own play style and really express your play style, your skill, your strategy. All of those things come into play when you're actually playing a very functional map. And that's exactly what we want out of all of our maps, of course, but that core functionality is the most important foundation. And that's why it's so important to understand what these anatomical elements actually are. We go from that. We also, like I said, we need sufficient assets in the map just to facilitate the right amount of gameplay. So this obviously scales with how large your map is. If you have a very small map, you don't necessarily need more than maybe like 2 or 3 expansions per player, perhaps. Although I would say like 3, 4 is probably the minimum that I would ever go to personally. But you probably can make it work with just like, the main, the natural, the third, and maybe 1 to fight over. And that would be a total of 7 if you symmetricize it for 2 players. Now, that being said, the assets also come into play with like high value targets in the terrain. I would still suggest having quite a few of those even on a small map, but that's something that we can argue about, right? Like that, in that case, a ramp that can be held is an incredibly powerful asset. So if you have high ground bases, then it becomes much more important to do that in, for example. So proper pathways and courtyards for battles and army rotations is stuff that we already kind of touched on when I was talking about that core gameplay and the core functionality of something. It's just something that, makes sense to reiterate. And the last one is quite important, but obviously I would recommend getting the first 3 done beforehand. And the last one is something unique and something that essentially sets your map apart from all of the competition. Because no 2 maps are really going to play out identically, but there's a margin of error. There's an element of difference where ideally, like you want your map to really be set apart from the rest. Right now, we don't have so many high quality maps that we can just say, oh yeah, we actually are in a position where your map needs to be set apart. Like if it's high quality, it's already setting itself apart in that sense. But in an ideal world, maybe in a couple of months, we'll have had such a expansive map pool to the point where we won't need to rely so heavily on something like just having the bare minimum of quality to meet a certain threshold to be considered a functioning map. Ideally, that's not the bare minimum that we're going for. Ideally, we're going to be aspiring for something greater. And when you're aspiring for something greater, the best way that you can achieve something like that would be to make your map unique. I didn't really touch on visuals at all in this sense, but this is another area where this comes into play. If your map looks just like every other map out there, then that obviously shares its tile set because the tile sets themselves are a stylistic choice. That's another thing that you've got to bear in mind, so to speak. So obviously, the kind of unique thing about Parabola is that we have this weird, wacky middle area going on where you've got bridges, but then there's a buildable centerpiece that you could, in theory, try to hold. This is also something interactive. Remember that the bridges are not buildable terrain, but this center area could, in theory, be partially or completely walled off from that middle area. You can also choose to wall off from the expansions, but no matter what you do, this is a super high-value asset because it's the shortest time between the bases for the two teams. So bearing this in mind, this is something that I haven't seen done in another map for the Hydra game state at the very least. I'm sure there's something similar that people could point to for, a map pool at some point in Kespa. But the idea over here is that we have this area that you can choose to hold down. And the fact that my map is a 2v2 map as well, where it expects there to actually be 2 players on each team, kind of means that I have a lot more carte blanche to essentially do whatever I want and call it unique, because there have been very few attempts at seriously making 2v2 maps. There have been attempts at making 1v1 maps that have 4 player slots in them, but not really 2v2 maps, because 2v2 ladder is still not added to remastered as of the time of recording. And before that, really the only way you would get 2v2 maps are actually played is if you just played some pickup games or whatever with your friends or some publics on Battle.net or something. You're not going to get that kind of experience that you're looking for other than that. So I guess there's a couple of other things that are kind of unique about Parabola. For the most part, I would say a lot of that uniqueness has been integrated into this centerpiece. You will note as well that I touched on not just the fact that it's visually distinct, but also the fact that it has an interaction associated with it and that it has far-reaching implications for not just what you can do with it, but what happens after the fact. Then you have to start worrying about rotating across the sides over here, and maybe that gets locked down as well with the buildable high ground and stuff like that. There's all sorts of things that could, in theory, happen as a result of one team locking down this central area. So we've got to keep that in mind as well. And these are all some things that you should keep in mind when you're making your map is how can I find a way to design a centerpiece or work some element of something unique into my map that not only looks really nice, but also can be interacted with in a very unique way. You don't want to make a bunch of gimmicks. I feel like there's been a tendency for a lot of the melee maps in the modern era to essentially just incorporate pre-placed disruption fields and stuff oh yeah, here we go. Here's some D-webs on the ground and now you just can't attack here. Or they'll deliberately break the height levels of their terrain to make it so that units are blind walking through the middle of the map. And these are essentially the same things that the Starcraft 2 melee maps have to deal with, where a lot of those ended up being super gimmicky towards the end. Not personally a fan of that. I feel like the gameplay mechanics should come from, the way that the players exploit the terrain, not the terrain itself, if that makes any sense. And that's why I've obviously, in Hydra, I've reworked a lot of things, like height, for example, is no longer just RNG. But that all being said, we've got to keep in mind really what you're looking for initially is not necessarily to lean super heavy into the unique elements. However, I do find it's a lot easier for me to maintain motivation when I am working with something that is ultimately unique to my map, because it ends up feeling just more interesting to me. I'm more interested in making my own original content than I am making something super derivative. And I think most people are at that stage, which is probably why a lot of people who are interested in campaign maps completely avoid making something in a melee map environment. There's this presupposition or this predisposed notion that essentially a bias that a lot of campaign map makers have had is that they assume that if you're working within the environment of making a melee map, you lack some sort of creativity. But I think there's a huge amount of creative ideas that you can have, especially if you build an understanding of how certain elements interact with the game and how high-level players or high-level AI or even just regular players and regular AI are going to potentially try to abuse these mechanics or, make use of certain base layouts or whatever. It can be quite impactful in just even if you only have intentions of making and releasing campaign content or some sort of use map settings type content that involves altered melee scenarios. It still pays dividends to know what makes a good map in a functional sense. And melee maps are a really easy way to learn about that. So I've talked about the anatomy of a map. I've given you some definitions. It's time to start really getting our hands dirty here. So we're going to jump into SCMDraft itself and start giving you guys a bit of a primer. Now, SCMDraft's starter guide, I've written myself over here. It's not like official first-party SCMDraft stuff, but this will walk you through actually setting up SCMDraft, and it will also walk you through setting up a Hydra game state environment for your SCMDraft like profile, basically, so that when you launch SCMDraft, you'll be able to select a profile that actually supports the Hydra environment, the Hydra game state. So this would be like placing those units, but also being able to use the extended tiles, which is really the most important part if you ask me. I don't know if anybody watching this will intend to be utilizing the Hydra game state necessarily. I am going to, because it's just a more complete game state for editing. And if you end up just ripping the tile sets and not keeping any of the other elements that have been added into Hydra, that's totally fine as well. I guess eventually we'll have our own version of the Hydra tile sets that have been separated from the Hydra game state, so you won't have to do that work yourself, in theory. But if you just want to work within the Hydra game state, check out the Mapping Starter Guide. Link is in the description. Of course, the link to download SCMDraft will also be in the description, in case you don't have it already. SCMDraft is pretty much important. Like it's definitive. It's the map editor for Starcraft. It's basically impossible, as far as I'm concerned, to make a quality map with StarEdit or any other mapping software out there. I think Heiderman's actually working on a new one called like CHK Forge or something. I haven't seen whether or not it's been updated. That might have some promise, particularly since it'll be open source and SCMDraft isn't. But right now, SCMDraft is king, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, at least not with any sense of, I wouldn't bet on it, I'll put it to you that way. SCMDraft's extended feature set is super important. It has mod support, it has extended tile support. It's going to be really important if you end up doing anything other than very, very basic map editing in the future. So I highly recommend getting familiar with it. That being said, we are going to walk through some of the initial feature sets. It might seem daunting if you've never used SCMDraft before at all, but I still think it's important to start getting used to that stuff. And I'm going to talk about every single thing that I'm doing in the early stages of this map making process. So you should be able to use exactly the same features that I'm going to be using in the exact same ways to generate something similar to what I'm going to generate right now. Now, as we get into the map, the first thing that you should do after you've set up your profile by following that text guide that I was talking about earlier, and that is linked in the description, you should be pretty equipped to get things started by making a new map. So you can hit Control-N, or you can click that white button at the top left, and you're greeted with the new map dialog. Now, you'll notice down here there's default melee triggers. You can also do melee with observers. I suppose we can do that. Melee with observers, 6 players. We're going to be doing a 1v1 map. So I usually just use default melee triggers and then edit them as necessary, but I actually have not experimented with this too much, but I'm pretty sure this works out fine, so you can definitely do that. Let's pick a tile set for our map. I actually haven't thought about what we want to do. I guess we'll do jungle. Jungle's like super general in terms of how it's put together. The tile set is certainly the most expansive. It has north-facing ramps and Hydra for pretty much everything that you might need. Temple, high dirt, and I think it even has like the Badlands structure and stuff ported as well, so we'll get into that. We'll also be able to talk about brushes a little bit later, and in general, we're going to get started on a 1 versus 1 map. I'm going to keep the map size at 128 by 128. You can obviously change it to be smaller or bigger if you want to, but since we're making a 1v1 map, this is a pretty reasonable size. I generally wouldn't want to make a map smaller than this ever, but that's because I prefer large-scale stuff. I actually prefer non-1v1s, believe it or not. So we've created our map. You'll notice I also set the base tile to dirt. By default, it's water. I don't know why. Feel free to set it to something else if you wanted to be like high dirt or something. It doesn't really matter though. We can zoom out by holding control and scrolling. You can also just scroll over here if you want to, but I'm used to control and mouse scrolling. So mouse wheel scroll plus holding control will get you this view all the way at 25%. You'll see that because the map, the view is like taller than it is, or it's wider than it is tall, we have to kind of scroll around so that we can see the full map. And that we get this giant black area to the right. Don't worry about that. That's expected. Now, if you direct your attention to this bottom middle area, you're going to see mirror symmetry is my default selection. I think by default it's actually no, but for me it's mirror because that's what I was using last, and I just had everything unticked. So mirror symmetry works with isometric. If you wanted to go for tile rotational symmetry, so that you could use something other than isometric, I think mirror might also work with rectangular. Yeah, it does. but it's not going to work with like copying and pasting and stuff. So you got to keep that in mind. Oh yeah, and here it's actually a good opportunity for me to show you guys this terrain palette. So I usually keep this on the left side of my view, on the right side of my second monitor. That was a bit of a mouthful. We're going to keep it over here so you guys can actually see what's going on. And you'll notice that when we switch to subtile, this is what shows up. When we switch to tile set indexed, this is what shows up. And we could close it and just not worry about it, but it's actually useful if we keep it open. Tile set index is seemingly very complicated if you've never seen it before, but it's literally every tile indexed in the tile set. This is actually quite useful if we need to fill in some other tile, and we'll get into that a little bit later. It's a little bit too early for that right now, but you might as well get used to scrolling through here and seeing if you're using the updated tile set for Hydra. If you're not using the updated tile set for Hydra, then you'll probably only need to use this for very specific cases where you're trying to make blends, in which case it's not really my duty to help you in that sense. I don't think it'll be that important going forward. If you're not using the Hydra game state, you're probably not going to be worrying too much about stuff. You're going to have to like copy and paste ramps from like stupid palette maps and stuff. So I can't help you there, man. I've long since avoided that. So as you can see with Mirror X triggered and our isometric view set, or our isometric tile set, we are seeing that we have, in fact, mirrored stuff. So we can start painting, for example, water. And you'll see that our water, which is modified in Hydra to look a little swampier, is being mirrored. Now, there are some very odd cases that I've seen, not with just Mirror X, but with all three of these checked, where you're essentially painting, all four corners at the same time. There have been cases where I've seen like slight mouse movements actually desync this stuff. I can't speak to how accurate it will always be, but that is also something to keep in mind. So I'm going to just Control Z here so that we don't have any of that water. And also you should note that in your profile, you should be able to set how many times you want to be able to undo. I have mine set to 250 because I figure that's probably enough. I think by default it's much lower. So if you're a fanatic who likes to do a lot of light clicking and stuff, and then you want to Control Z a bunch of shit, you might want to increase that in the profile settings, just so you know. That's options, profile settings. Another thing, I guess, default options are probably pretty bad for SCMDraft, I guess. Something that you should remember to do is essentially make your options and display options look something like mine. I never have animate unit death on. It also ends up creating rubble, which stays around for quite a while. So I would just not have that. Show powered status, I guess you could take that or leave that. I find it useful. If you're pre-placing a lot of units, or if you're placing mineral fields and you want to see what the terrain is underneath, you can hit cloak or hide units in display options temporarily just to remove them so that you can see how the terrain looks. I'll probably use that a little bit later on once we actually get resources into this map. Sprites are the same way, except that it's going to affect sprites that are placed on the map, not unit sprites. Well, if they're in the sprite layer, basically. Which is basically like how some people will get invisible or completely pathable versions of certain doodads or whatever placed in all over the place. Doodad sprites are specifically if you've placed like a tree in the doodad layer and it has a sprite associated with it, that will hide that. Everything else here is fairly straightforward. Color cycling, I think that's when you just that must be for the water. So with that option off, you can see that we don't have color cycling. If I turn it on, you'll see the water start to move. That's basically what that is. So I guess if you're running a super low-end GPU or something, but I actually don't know why you would want to turn that off. Maybe you just don't like the cycling. In options, I highly recommend you turn off enable sound. When you place a unit like a siege tank, for example, and this option is on, your ears will explode. I warned you. Aside from that, I recommend that on map load, you have neither of these options selected. On copy, cut, paste, you have include doodad tiles ticked. And what else? Doodads allow illegal placement is always good. I have my location set to snap to active grid so that if I need to snap it to a grid, I can hit Control G to toggle the grid. That's super specific though. You don't really need to worry about that. And what else do we have here? Building snap to tile. I don't have my unit snap to grid. I don't think it's necessary. Ignore building placement collisions is worded really stupidly. Basically, it means that if, for example, you wanted to place an SCV right next to a command center, in a move that would be 100% legal to move that unit in StarCraft itself, if that option is not enabled, it will not allow it. So if you have disabled ground unit stacking on, it essentially uses the placement box as the unit bound instead of the actual placement collision box. Or collision, but fuck, man, this is so unimportant. Basically, don't worry about this, but it's only really important if you're like pre-placing units and shit. Allow air unit stacking. I just turned that off, but you can keep it on if you want to, I guess. And place units anywhere and buildings anywhere is useful for me. It basically means that they could ignore the walkable or unbuildable terrain. It's really useful to have these options on for placing mineral fields in what are technically unbuildable and unwalkable scenarios, but not necessarily like illegal from the perspective of actually being able to mine them. So I always have these options on. Require mineral distance I have off in case I need to, for some reason, put a start location closer to the mineral fields, which we won't need to worry about in this particular case, probably. Add-on auto player swap, super basic. Just means that if you place an add-on for player 6 and then you place a factory next to it for player 2, then the add-on becomes player 2's unit. I think that's everything. Maybe turn off clip names and locations, I guess, if you want. I don't know. That's the only other thing that I would say. All right, we're through the SCMDraft settings. Now we can get into actually using SCMDraft to start working on our map. Now, while I was messing around over there, I noticed that we had a little bit of a water creature going on over here, and I kind of like that. Maybe we'll have our map be called like Kraken or something. And so I kind of want to start working on map boundaries. When you're starting on a map, the most intimidating process, at least for me, is getting through the canvas stage. So we are going to very quickly slap down a working outline, a functional outline for our map. We're going to get into that. And as we do, we'll figure out how it's going to take shape. The most important thing for me, for my flow state, is music in the background. You might also like podcasts or something. I recommend you throw that on while you're making a map. For now, I'll treat you to a bit of a speed terrain while I do this, and I'll interrupt it occasionally with post-commentary or live commentary, depending on whether or not I have something insightful to say. I should also mention that symmetry is 100% your friend in the environment of making a melee map, especially some of your first maps. Symmetry essentially cuts your work in half or sometimes in 3/4, depending on how heavy you go with the symmetry. In my case, I'm going to be using mirror XY symmetry, which means that the top right and bottom left are going to be symmetrical, and the bottom right and top left are going to be symmetrical, but that otherwise we're not going to have that symmetry going on. So for example, if I place some water over here, you'll see that it's symmetrical in the top right and the bottom left. I place some water over here in the bottom right-ish area, it'll be in the top left-ish area. That's where my symmetry is going to be. I think it's a little bit more unique than just mirror X or mirror Y or whatever, although I have seen arguments for both. So we might even incorporate multiple symmetries into this, but I probably think I'll keep that for the second video, just in the interest of keeping things very simplified here. Another thing I should mention is that you should always save your map incredibly often. Probably disable the autosave stuff in profile settings and just remember to Control S after every fucking change like a lunatic. That's what works for me. Don't worry about any compatibility warnings. We're always going to save our map as a .scx file, because that's what enables all of the triggers that we're going to potentially need, but also all of the player colors and all the other stuff like that we most certainly want to have at our disposal. So just click in this drop-down menu, select Starcraft Brood War map, and we'll just go ahead and save it in some folder over here. I guess I'll just call it tutorial 1v1. And you can call yours whatever we want. We'll give ours a proper name a little bit later. Going to change my selection size for the isometric brush by moving my mouse over here and just sort of scrolling around. You can also obviously click and pick, but no point in doing that when you can scroll and save a few precious seconds. We want to ensure proper spacing between some of these cliffs, which is why I haven't put the raised jungle super close to the high dirt. It's just to make sure that if we need to have an army rotate through here, we're going to have plenty of space to do that without necessarily having to interact with the cliff if there are units on it or something like that. I've already got a pretty good idea of where I want my players' mains to go. Because of the way that the XY symmetry has worked out so far, I think it would be super cool to have a main here and a main here. Whereas initially I was thinking this would just be a high value third or something. I think if these are the mains, the rush distance becomes super small, and you still get a decent amount of control over your right side or left side of the map. But the ways that you interact with the map is a little bit different than it being your bottom half versus top half, which is initially where I thought we were going. I also think this high dirt complex over here is maybe a little bit too boring and like just dime a dozen in a lot of melee maps. So I will probably work this in a little bit differently, but for now it's a nice piece of terrain that I can manipulate a little bit later. Again, we're not super concerned about details right now. We're going to start working on the layout of the mains and all of that stuff, make sure that we have a decent amount of build space. But aside from some of those key concepts, like we were talking about earlier, about making sure that you have enough build space and have enough army rotation space to make a melee map really work in a functional sense, don't really have to worry too much about all of these little details, like how large a certain area actually is going to end up. Stuff like this is a little bit of a small inaccuracy, which is why it always pays to check the other side, because something that might have worked out in the bottom half may not always work out in the top half, so always keep your eyes out for stuff like that. Another thing that it really helps for, in my opinion, is if you're ever a little unsure about what to do next with your layout, you might check the other half of what you've been working on, and maybe you'll get a little bit of a different idea based on the fact that you've seen something else. Might help you. It was at this moment that I realized that SCMDraft 2 had crashed on me, or rather frozen, so in such a case, you obviously need to make sure that you're saving very frequently. Remember, that's what I did say earlier, save like a lunatic. It will actually help you, in more cases than it will hurt you. Alright, we are going to add some bridges in SCMDraft. To do that, we are going to select the doodad layer by holding Control and hitting D on our keyboards. We can also go to Layer and select doodads from this drop-down menu up at the top. After that, you'll notice that there's a doodads menu over here. So we're going to expand that if it's not already expanded. We're going to go to Bridges, and we're going to select bridge number 3. In this case, you can also click one of them and just up arrow, down arrow until you find the right one. We're going to go ahead and place this one here. It's not quite as wide as we want it to be, however, so we're definitely going to need to change that. Let's also go ahead and place the next bridge over here. This one is going to be a bit easier to extend than the previous one. Now that we've placed it, we can select it as long as we're in the doodad layer with just left clicking. We're going to right click and hit convert to terrain. This will mean it's no longer a doodad. As you can see, we're in the doodad layer. We can't select it, but we can, in the terrain layer, start moving stuff around. So we're going to hold shift to make sure that we're adding stuff to our selection. We're going to select these bottom pieces over here. We're going to hold Control C, Control V to copy. And when we place it here, you'll notice that everything seems to be fine. You know, we've just moved it over. Now we've got to fill in the central pieces. So now I'm going to select this tile over here. Control C, Control V. Paste it around. And then I'm going to select this tile over here. Control C, Control V. And we should be in the clear. Just to make sure that everything's good, I'm going to untick Use Defaults over here. Under Micro Tile Overlay, I'm going to scroll down once to select Impassable. And as you can see here, I've actually still got a couple of impassable terrain blocks here. It's because I didn't replace these ones. So we're just going to go ahead and do that now. And there you go. We've got our bridge. Eventually, this will be in the brush palette. I forgot that it wasn't already. So if you stay tuned for the next episode, I will actually show you how to use the brush palette in great detail. So until then, you can feel free to mess around with it yourself if you don't want to wait until that video comes out, or you simply don't want to watch that. So now we're going to go back to none in the micro tile overlay. Tick Use Defaults once again. And we're going to go back over to the next one. Do the same thing here. This time I'm going to select a couple of extra tiles just so that I don't have to do a lot of the same multitasking and micromanagement of the tiles. We do have a terrain block over here. I'm not actually sure if it's properly set up in this tile set anywhere, so I'm going to give it a quick look. If I can't find the tile that needs to be put here because maybe it's not in the extended tile set, I'll just have to add it later on, and for now we'll just deal with that terrain block. Well, it turns out that tile wasn't there after all, so we're just going to leave that one there. We could, of course, butcher our layout, and maybe we still want to later on just to fix that particular issue without adding a custom tile into the mix, but for now I think it's fine to just leave it the way it is. Let's switch over to the unit layer by hitting Control U for unit. Now, crucially, as we switch over here and get started placing some mineral fields, we need to make sure that we leave enough space between where we want to place these resources and our opponents, where our opponents might be able to take some map control. For example, if somebody puts a siege tank over here and they can snipe at our players' workers, that's going to be quite a big imbalance, even though there's a nice little bridge right over there. Because ultimately, it's kind of hard to contest map control up here. So we want to make sure that it's nothing too unfair. The other thing is, given the short rush distance, you may be inclined to just start working on some quick air units if you want to attack over here. If you've played StarCraft 2 multiplayer in the beta of that game, which is super old and nobody watching this has done that, you may remember the Void Rush cheese, the Void Ray rush cheese. So yeah, that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from this, particularly on a map called Oasis. It was very, very powerful. We don't want to have a repeat of anything related to StarCraft 2 in our work, so we're going to make sure that we leave enough space behind the mineral fields so that you can place missile turrets or something similar if you need to, and also so that you can maneuver some ground units around there. So with that said, it means that we've kind of said we can't place any mineral fields up here along this ridge for the fear of this. And we also can't really do it over here for the same reason, because siege tanks can and will probably take a look. In fact, just so that we know that we are 100% sure about that, we can make use of SCMDraft's range preview and place some siege tanks in the areas over here. And now we can go into untick Use Defaults again. There is a range display. We can select all players and then do ground outline. And we actually see that siege tanks are incapable of reaching all the way over here. And they are pretty much the big dogs in terms of attacking units. So I don't think Guardians will be able to outrange them, for example. So I think we're actually quite safe about like not worrying too much about this. So we're going to go ahead and Control Z on that one, buddy, and remove all those tanks and get back to Use Defaults for our overlay settings. And we can safely grab this area for resources. Now in the units selection, we're going to go ahead and go to Neutral, Resources, Mineral Field. We're going to hit the equals key on our keyboard, or just select player 12 from this list. And that's going to make it so that our units that we're about to place are going to be in player 12's hands. Player 12 should be the owner of all resources and critters on your map. if you decide to place critters like some kind of lunatic. And again, we want to keep plenty of space for, you know, room for missile turrets and stuff like that. I think it's colloquially referred to as turret room in the circles that swim around this sort of area. So we're going to make sure that we've got at least, you know, 3 tiles worth of space in case somebody wants to even put a bunker there. And we're going to get started on placing that stuff. Let's figure out where the safe zone is for up here as well, though. Let me just quickly jump over to siege tank siege mode. I'll place a couple over here. Select these units and hit 1 on your keyboard to give them to player 1, although I think the range display would work no matter what, but just in case. And as we can see, we can't really go any higher than this for fear of our mineral fields being besieged by siege tanks. So we'll just Control-Z on that one, buddy, again. Go back to equals and go to use defaults. We are going to move this one down, and then we'll start from here. In a very puzzling turn of events, some people enjoy using the randomized start location button in scenario, the randomized minerals button rather. As you can see, it doesn't always give you good results, so I'm going to stick with manually placing mine. Obviously, you can do however you like. In terms of how many minerals I like to place for my bases, for the mains, I like to go somewhere between 8 and 10. Anything above 8 or maybe 9 is like, I think 9 might be the standard actually in 1v1 melee and Brood War, like in an unmodded Brood War. However, you can pretty much go for whatever you want. I just encourage you to make things symmetrical for your first couple maps, and then you can figure out, oh, maybe I'll experiment with like giving one player an asymmetrical advantage in terms of terrain, see how that results in changes going forward. So I've got 9 mineral fields over here, but you'll notice that there is no symmetrical unit placement. That means what we have to do here is switch into rectangular mode for our tile types. And this is at least how I like to do it. I'm going to select some tile that'll stand out like mud. I'm actually going to paint underneath all of our mineral fields. I guess I should also paint underneath where I believe our Vespine geyser will go. And I think we can probably place our geyser up here. Let's just see where our start location will likely be placed. For that, I think we will jump over here. Place a start location for player 2. Again, pressing 2 on my keyboard along the home row to actually set the player that I'm going to place these resources for, and back to the equal sign for player 12. Place the geyser. Seems like I ballparked it well enough. Now what we can do is place some more mud over here. And remember, we're still in mirror XY mode, so now we've got a nice little outline over here for where we can place our minerals. We go ahead and copy all of these and paste them. I would love like a rotation command or something so that I don't have to manually do this every time. Maybe if enough people yell at SI for the potential to implement such a feature, he might jump on it. I think he mostly responds to what individuals are most interested in. So if there's a high likelihood that people will actually use the feature that people are asking for, i.e. there's a lot of people asking him about it, there's probably a greater likelihood of him actually implementing that. So SI, Suicidal Insanity, he's the guy who made SCMDraft, for those unaware, and you should be able to find him on the starit.net Discord, or in my Discord server, or, I don't know, a couple of other places on the web. Feel free to yell at him on my behalf, if you like. Let's go ahead and untick the range display. We don't need that anymore. We don't need Invalid Depot as well. We should be pretty good as far as I'm concerned. The one thing we might want to do is move the geyser over so that it's in line with the start location, completely vertically. Another thing you should know is this map will not technically be 100% symmetrical, because units harvest resources from geysers slightly faster if the geyser is north or to the left. So I guess that would be west? Yeah. So top or left geysers are going to harvest gas a lot slightly faster. So these two would harvest it more than this one or one over here on the right. I don't really care that much about that because it's not going to be as much, like, we're not targeting maps that are going to be like played at like by professional Koreans, because professional Koreans are never going to play Hydra. So we're not worried too much about that. And if it were holding people back from taking our map seriously to the point where we were actually concerned about that, we would probably just go into the code and find a way to fix that issue. Although it seems like a bit of a headache, so maybe not. This is where we're going to hop into display options and hit hide units. And we're going to go ahead and paint over the mud that we left over there. Double check that it's done over there, and it is, so we can display units again, and we have perfectly symmetrical mineral fields and geysers and start locations. Now we seem to be in business. I've already got some idea of where I want our naturals to go, so I guess we'll get started on placing those, doing the same thing that we just did here to get them in position symmetrically, and then we'll start thinking about the thirds and perhaps fourths more along this area, and we want to make sure that we give an opportunity for map control within this giant courtyard area over here. So we'll probably have some high ground area that you can hold on to and maybe build walls around or something, and yeah, so starting to take shape. We'll see where we go from here. All right, so I've just made another base symmetrical. One thing that's super helpful for me to remember is to, if I've made all of the terrain changes, to mark where the positions actually are in the same sort of action string. What I can actually do is once I have actually placed all of these resources in a symmetrical area, I can Control C, Control Z until they're all gone. Wait for the tiles to be gone as well, and then Control V and paste them. That way I don't have to go back and clean up the temple in the same way that I had to clean up the jungle over here to get rid of the mud tiles. One thing I am a bit concerned about is if I decide to make this terrain up here on the high ground a little bit, like a temple on top of Temple Cliff, because we have that blend in Hydra, it might cause some issues height-wise with this mineral field over here. In such a case, I might just move the temple high ground piece down one tile rather than shuffle around the minerals, since I think moving the temple bit will be slightly less of a gameplay impact than moving the resource bit. That's just an issue that you run into with Starcraft not really being designed around the idea of symmetry and symmetrical maps, which is why, for example, cliffs have, like, obviously 3 tiles tall up here, but only 2 tiles tall up here. That's the source of a lot of issues with symmetry. So just keep that in mind. Don't get too frustrated if you can't make something exactly symmetrical. Again, we're not really targeting super like high level Brood War and all that stuff. Like, we don't need professional players to be happy with these maps. We just need to be happy with them ourselves, and also decently convinced of their quality enough, right? So I've also worked on this natural at this point. I'm fairly confident about this layout insofar as we're going to have like bridges and stuff over here that or ramps rather, that I'll place shortly. I'll probably be shuffling this raised jungle off a little bit because I had to extend the temple quite forward in order to justify the base placement over here. That all being said, I still think this is looking good initially. It's just a matter of making sure we have nice like push and pull environment throughout. So for example, I might have a bit of terrain over here or unwalkable doodads, perhaps, that stop players from just rushing across this bridge and directly into the natural while ignoring the main. At the same time, anything I place over here is going to come at the cost of build space in the main, which I have to be cognizant of. So these are kind of the things that I'm weighing back and forth as I put together some of these map ideas. That being said, this natural doesn't offer too much build space. Might consider expanding it up over here. In fact, maybe that's something I'll explore right now. I'm also going to mark where I'm going to include some high temple terrain that's stacked on top of the existing temple by placing some jungle over here, and then I'll just paint over it a little bit later on. Now that we've extended the temple so far, it's pretty obvious we're going to need to get rid of some of this raised jungle. So we'll just get rid of it completely, and then I'll see how I want to work it in a little bit later, after I've gotten the ramps up into this area settled. For now, we'll also slap down a bit of a temple outpost over here. This might change and turn into raised jungle a little bit later, just so that I can keep that thematic and visual diversity and all that shit up. But until then, we will leave it at that. So I'm placing this ramp from a brush palette. I guess I can quickly go over the basics of a brush palette. Once you have it loaded in here, which you can do with this load button or by setting it in your profile preferences, you want to right click and hit medium images. It doesn't get saved, unfortunately, because SI refuses to update this part of the program. But you can select jungle from this list if you're using the Hydra jungle state or jungle state game state. And as you can see, we've got some wider ramps than normal. So I'm going to be placing this one, but I'm going to count off how far away from the rightmost edge that I'm placing it so that I can make this symmetrical. Because the mirror symmetry isn't going to pick this up anyway, but even if it did, it would just place this tile here instead of another ramp over there. So we're going to have to manually make sure that our ramps are lining up correctly. The closer this ramp is to the mineral fields as a straight direct line, and the closer it is as a straight direct line to the start location, the more defensible it is. So that's another thing that I can use to balance the map a little bit differently. If I want the natural to be a little bit harder to hold on to or easier to attack into, I can take this ramp and actually push it further down, because then you have to interact with less of the player's main in order to squeeze into his natural. That being said, this pathway is very, very straightforward, which I like. I can create a much cheekier pathway into this area by going into here and having it be quite far up. Maybe something like this. I might even choose to link up these two pieces of terrain by doing something like this. But I don't really like how that uses this space, so I probably won't. However, maybe including a little bit more over here wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. It's just that we have to make sure that we're lined up here. Otherwise, I will be quite mishappy. No other reason, of course, just that. Now that we've modified our terrain a little bit, I'm going to start placing this ramp right over here. And I actually want it to line up a little bit with what's going to be a north-facing ramp over here, which we can set up right now. As you can see, it's not quite lined up, so I am going to move it to the left by one, and then we're going to place this one. Don't worry about this hanging over there. I will fix that in a moment. And what we'll find over here, especially if we add a little bit of jungle and place another one of these, is that suddenly we've got quite a topsy-turvy up and down area, which is kind of unique. You don't see this kind of geometry in most maps, and maybe for good reason, but for now we're going to assume that we can make that work. So now I'm going to fix this stuff using the tileset index. If I control left click on any tile, similar to how it selects your isometric brush when you're in the isometric brush mode, if I control left click on this ramp, for example, it will actually take me to that position in the tile set, and then I can start scrolling around and looking for some different tiles. I actually know that the tile that I'm looking for is much farther up, so I am going to quickly control left click on this, and we are going to grab this tile. And, oh wait, no, I actually need a different one for that. It is in this tile set. I just have to remember exactly where. Right, so I found the tile that I need. I'll go ahead and slap that there. We got a little bit of a hanging edge over there. Pretty easy to fix. I actually had to go into another map to find the other one, but we found it, and that's what matters, boys. Looks like Mirror Symmetry picked up our copy and paste attempts, so we can just quickly edit over those. And then we can use the brush palette to place the north-facing ones that we need over here. And just like that, we've got ourselves quite a few ramps that simply didn't exist in the base game, which is one of the reasons why it's so nice to use the Hydra game state, and also another reason why it's pretty epic to use SCMDraft, because you get to actually use some of this stuff and place it in relatively convenient ways. That being said, it looks like that'll be it for this first session of work on this map, so I'm going to do a quick cut. We'll get into the next one. So we're back with another session of working on this map. You'll notice I've already named it. Well, maybe you'll notice. You'll notice it now. It's called The Underwood, which is a very old inside joke reference. Maybe I'll change that. Maybe I won't. Sometimes I find it actually is pretty nice to just get a name out there, even if it doesn't necessarily stick, and then I work with it from there. So I've just booted up SCMDraft. I've made no changes since the last time I recorded a session, but I will show you what I do every single time I boot up SCMDraft and open a map up, because maybe it'll be useful for you. First thing I do always is scroll through the isometrical drop-down menu there until this pops up, and then I move it to the other monitor, as I mentioned earlier. Then I will go into Windows, select Brush Palette, and then load up whichever palette I'm working with. In this case, it's Jungle. I will then right-click, hit Medium Images, because again, it doesn't save your preferences, and then I will move this over here. By the way, I guess as a general note, some things may actually eventually get updated in this editor, in which case, hopefully stuff that I complain about is actually fixed, but again, don't hold your breath too much. So I've got my palette and my tileset index all the way on the left-hand side. That is something that I perpetually look to. Obviously, if you don't have a 2-monitor setup, then you won't have that luxury, but you can always move it perhaps like I did to the right of the view, or maybe like off screen a little bit. And then maybe you just want to stack them up together in the same spot, in that case, to take up as little screen space as possible. I have the luxury of being able to move them both side by side, or one above the other, or whatever I want, really. So it's actually quite useful. Now, I will move this to this screen just so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to scroll through the list until I find the mud blend with jungle. And I'm going to paint a bit of a town hall marker. So the town hall, town center, is a catch-all term for command center, nexus, hatchery, and all of its morphs. Basically anything that you can return resources to, a resource depot, you could say. And generally speaking, even though in Hydra you have some more options, most people are going to have their essential area be covered by, they're going to build one of those structures that I just mentioned. So we want to give the right amount of space for that. And then I like to, personally, paint a little bit of something so that you get a good idea of where you should actually be placing your structure. So we could do it through mud, this is how I would do it if I were going to do this. I would select just any tile from the north facing, and then I would select any west and then east, so left and then right. And then I would go and grab something that faces bottom left, and then I would grab something that faces bottom right, and then I would grab a corner, so in this case it would be this one, and then here. Oh, and by the way, you can actually resize this left and right, and that will actually make it a little bit easier for you to see better depending on which tile you're actually trying to paint. So in this case, I'm working with a set of tiles that has 5 variants, so it's actually useful for me to have it be either 5 or 10 across. I find 10 is actually unreasonably wide, but that would be an example. So now when I get to the end of the list on a horizontal row, I know I have to go down to the next row because, oh yeah, well, obviously if we're after 5, then the next one is going to be the other angle. So that is just an intuitive way to set your brush up in that sense. And this is what I do every single time. Now we've got something of a town hall marker. So if we put the invalid depot flag in after unticking use defaults, we'll see that, yeah, the start location is still there and all that, but we have this mud here that sort of signifies where you should be placing that town hall. So normally you won't have this start location to help out. We only have a base over on the temple right now, so I can't really show you much else, but I will scroll around and hopefully I can find some temple doodads here. I don't remember if I actually made a brush for those or not. It does not appear that I did. That being said, I should be able to find those in the tileset index somewhat easily, question mark? So here they are, and amongst these doodads, we have this version on the left being the medium ground, and the one on the right being the high ground. And I usually place these for the sake of signifying where, broadly speaking, your town center should go. This is my way of doing it on Temple anyway. One thing you will notice, however, is that you can indeed get to the point where you have this ugly sort of surrounding area, which is quite unfortunate, and you would like to be able to not have that. But that is a per tile basis type thing, so I would actually have to offset the canvas below it in Photoshop in order for that to line up correctly. So we will just simply not place anything there, but in a perfect world we would have some other tile, and maybe I'll even make another tile later on. That's something that I have the luxury of being able to do since I have the know-how to edit tiles. You, as a random mapper, will probably not have the same confidence, but I certainly encourage you to try, because you might as well get into the tile set editing stuff. You're going to want to do it for a proper campaign map or scenario map or whatever anyway. So if it helps you out in your melee endeavors, then it would be a good test bed for that in that sense. So anyway, moving away from that, I actually don't want to have mud either. I actually want to have ruins, which I will place just doing this, and then I will copy and paste them over. Now, technically, Jungle has the same sort of issue with borders, but it's much harder to spot at a glance, so I will be okay with that. And in case you are wondering, ruins are buildable in Hydra, so that's why I'm comfortable placing them in this position. I do find it a lot easier, generally speaking, to place the tile and then copy and paste it and move it into the next area. Obviously, sometimes it will line up with where the isometric tile wants to place it, and when it does, that's great, but copying and paste, that's not really that big of a deal. It can be your friend, in fact. So, let's move on. Another thing I did want to check is whether or not this gas structure was snipeable from this angle using siege tanks. I feel like I did check this in the first session, but I don't remember if I checked it very well. So we are going to place a siege mode tank. And we're going to try to get them... This is actually where we can go into options and go to place units anywhere and toggle that off. We'll just try to get them as close as legally allowed. And then we'll place one a couple a little bit further back. And we will now go into the range display, all players, ground outline. It does look like even these ones that are further back might be able to hit a refinery or something to that effect. So we will want to be taking all of this and either moving this down or moving this up. And so that is sort of the question. Remember, we're going to go into mirror symmetry, hit mirror XY, control left click on the water to change that to our active selection, and then move this like so. And if we pan on over here, it should have done the same thing, which we do see. Now, the question then becomes, do we want to make any changes from there? And I think we will give that little bit of a cliff back, just for a little bit of variety in that sense. And as you can see, it did indeed work. So, let's see where we go from there. I've been thinking a little bit about what to do about these corners. I still really like the idea of having a bit of a defensible choke point here, some high ground with a one-way ramp or something, and then also having a high-value expansion towards the middle of the map that's maybe a little bit more challenging to hold on to. I think that makes sense as maybe a more risky third, and then we can have safer bases in the corners that can be contested on the outskirts of the map and draw some more action there. in general, you'll have more access to more resources if you combine the two bases. So the main goal will be to have a safe base and a not so safe base in both corners and allow players to jockey over those positions, and then also use any sort of area that they secure across this bridge to vie for further control of the corners if need be. And I think that can add a really nice dynamic, actually. So we're going to convert this high dirt corner into raised jungle, and then we're going to fill in some more info on that raised jungle later on. I've got a couple of different tiles on Hydra that allow me to stack, for example, dirt cliff on top of raised jungle, as well as some other things. I'll probably throw in some swamp for a nice little visual flair at a later stage after we're done with the initial work. And then we can get to cracking on placement for resource areas. We'll figure out exactly the spacing for some of the general areas in the higher value bases. And maybe, just maybe, we might even decide to, make a final decision as to how the rest of the map layout is going to look like. So let's get to it. What I'm doing here is measuring the distance between the top border of the map and the end of the top cliff, comparing that to the distance of the bottom border of the map to the end of the bottom cliff, so that I can get some parity of build space tiles between the two sides. As Starcraft itself has the disparity where the bottom facing cliff is 3 tiles tall versus the north facing cliff is obviously 2 tiles tall, you have to take that into account in some fashion. It's obviously up to you to decide how you want to do it or if you want to mess with it at all. In the later stages of this session, I actually mess up and have to error correct my complication, but I'm obviously just going to skip past that for this sake, because at the end of it, it's what I wanted it to be anyway. I'm just going to skip the part where I look silly. I will, however, show you how to quickly copy and paste some manual tile placements so that you can skip some of the boring, busy work after having to make a correction like this. Okay, that was pretty simple. Obviously making ample use of the undo tool to select an old state and then copy and paste that and then redo and then jump right in. So the way that you can check for buildable tiles, of course, is that you can obviously jump into the building placeability section. But the other thing that I do is I just extend my brush over here and I see, okay, we've got, for example, if I control left click on the R jungle, the raised jungle, I can then see, okay, now I've got 2 actually on this side, whereas over here, I've got pretty much the same thing. I've actually got 3 on this side as the disparity between 2 14-sized brushes. You would actually expect that to be slightly more build space on the lower side because of the fact that the HUD actually takes up the bottom couple of tiles or so. So in essence, this is actually still offset, I believe, in the north side's favor. So yeah, I guess some trivia for you. If you ever find yourself being able to pick your side, you might want to pick the one that doesn't interact with the bottom of the map as much. This second session ended pretty abruptly as I had to go do something at the end of it, so we'll just get right into the third. And we're back with a third session, because 3. This is probably where things end, because 3. But we're going to see how far we can take this map now. It's been some time since my last session. Again, have not edited it in the slightest since the previous recording segment, and we're going to jump straight into placing some of those expansions I was talking about, refining some of the terrain, eventually triggering out the AI so that we can observe a match between the AI, and after that we'll see what we think in reflection. I'll give some roadmaps for how I might change the map going forward into the future, but we'll probably close the video after watching a brief game of the AI, maybe sped up slightly. We'll see how that changes. So speaking of changes, this recording is coming after the rename of Hydra to Cosmonarchy, which you might have noticed if you took a look at the, once again, the little name up here at the top. It's now Cosmonarchy instead of Hydra. Indeed, the project has been renamed, and amongst the changes that came from not just the rename, but the whole massive patch that happened as a result of the rename, or at the same time as the rename, one of the things that we all seemed to take notice of is that playing on maps with very limited gases actually don't go over too well. And one of the concerns that I have, more broadly speaking, is that if I'm depriving the players, regardless of whether or not they're AI or humans or whatever, of resources, then I'm actually enforcing a lower scale, lower tier game, we'll say, lower tech game. And I actually don't think this is a massive issue if you're designing a map for the Cosmonarchy game state, because there are still a number of options at tier 1 for all races that kind of, in a way, it's almost like you have as many options at tier 1, 1.5, maybe even borderline 2. You have equivalent numbers of options as the whole game of vanilla, because that's how many more options are here. If you're designing for a vanilla game state or a lightly modded game state or a completely different game state entirely, I mean, that's obviously on you to figure out how many resources you need. But I would find that it's totally reasonable to experiment with those, and maybe I'll show off some of the things that I'm going to do briefly in this particular video, but I think I'll save the really crazy stuff for some of the later videos where I do get a bit more kooky, we'll say, with the resource placement. So I guess keep your eyes peeled for some future maps that I'll make in this series, like 2v2 one that'll come up after this. So for now, the agenda is to update the resource areas that we already have. We only have 2 for each player, so that shouldn't take too long. Then I'm going to revise some of the terrain in the central areas of the map by the temple, because I have an idea for how to improve the layout there, and I'll talk about what I'm going to do specifically when I get there. And after that, we're going to jump into the corners and place those more safer thirds that maybe will have less resources than some of the other positions that we were just mentioning. And after that, I think the map should be good to go. We'll get everything triggered for an AI observation game. We'll run an AI test, and I'll talk about my general feelings of the map therein. So that's the third segment coming up at you right now. Let's start by making some changes to the temple. I was never really massively satisfied with how deep these cut-ins were, and I feel like it's kind of wasted space. And the other thing that it does is obviously it intrudes on build space for the temple side of things, the natural, we'll say. The natural gets less build space as a result of this change, but it's not even really useful build space for the main either, because what are you going to build up here? Maybe depots or something, but even then it's very difficult to actually get in there and place the tiles without getting your mason stuck, so it's all just a disaster if you were trying to even do that in that situation. And obviously it's a very Terran-centric example, but yeah, I guess we'll get my tile set index out, my brush palette out, like I was mentioning earlier. Let's go ahead and move that over there. So yeah, one of the things that I am massively concerned about, I guess, is build space, especially given the fact that, I mean, yeah, I guess you have a lot of general build space in this arc, but it's not a huge epic element either. It's not like, it's not a massive amount, and if we can add a little bit more by doing this, so be it. I don't think it's a loss by any means. In fact, we might even go a step further and say do something like this. So we keep the cutaway here to try and preserve some terrain direction, but otherwise we expand it out something like that. So we get that element of symmetry, and we still have the cuts, but they're much more vestigial and lower impact. And now obviously we have to correct this particular bridge, which shouldn't take too long. And there you go. So you keep the bridge, or bridge ramp, you know what I mean. And you obviously keep the extra space as well. And this will also allow us to then take the geyser count and up it slightly. So let's just make sure we're not placing this geyser in an illegal fashion, so you still have access. I was thinking maybe we even put it further back, because this is quite a safe base, and maybe it's okay to have bad gas pathing for the secondary geyser, given that this is quite a safe base. It is your natural base, so maybe that's kind of the trade-off. And if you wanted more efficient geysers, you might go to those more difficult, risky expansions that are high risk, high reward in that sense. So I think that might be what we do. Oh, I've just realized actually we've been asymmetrical with our approach here. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Obviously, it's something that I should have done at the beginning of this one, is turn mirror symmetry on. So just to make sure we're good. It looks like we're supposed to push this out one more, actually. So, yeah, that looks good. Turn it off for this. Okay. So now we've got our symmetrical changes, and we've added a second geyser to the natural base. I think that's probably okay. I was thinking about adding a second geyser to the mains as well, but I think for this map, again, it's a small map, it's like a 1 versus 1. I actually think it might be fine to allow for that lower tier, lower tech stuff, where, yeah, you do have more mineral-centric strategies, particularly in the opening, but still give the opportunity for your first expansion to provide you with whatever you might need. So yes, you can take the natural, and you can use that as an opportunity to push a little bit forward in the tech tree, or maybe you can take a more risky expansion as your natural out here, where maybe there's 3 geysers or 2 really well-placed geysers so that you get access to them. The other thing we can experiment with, by the way, is increasing, or even in some cases decreasing, the starting resources in a base. I don't think I would experiment too much with this in a 1 versus 1 map, because the scale is such that you're not going to have too many bases, so all of them need to be pretty readily impactful, like readily available to provide value. So you can't really justify it to the same degree. At least I am of the opinion that you can't. I'm sure there can be a compelling argument made for it. But that being said, the idea of having, say, like 2 geysers and both of them having 8,000 gas in reserve instead of 5,000, well, that's obviously a pretty big benefit just on the basis of when you go there, you throw down the expansion, you can essentially profit from the base for much longer period of time. It's money for you in the bank as long as you can keep hold of it, essentially. So again, with that in mind, that might be something that we use to influence our base layouts. That's not really too heavily instantaneously something you can experience just by looking at it. It might not be immediately obvious that that's what we've done when you just look at it from a layout perspective. But if you select the structure in game and you're like, oh shit, that's got way more gas, well, that's something that you can learn and remember the next time you play on the map, and maybe that can influence your strategy in the moment as you find it out. Now, I did say I wanted to change some parts of the map flow about this particular base. And the reason being is that I initially thought maybe the resources would be along this ridge over here that's opposite the blue start location in this particular example. So it's on the other side. And I thought that that would also help with maybe like positioning long-range units over there because, well, there's resources there, so it actually constrains how much positioning you can get. However, I think for map flow purposes, it feels really bad to be constrained to this very small pathway, and it's going to be even further constrained than it already is if you also have resources here. So a solution would be to move this and further up. Yeah, I know my original plan was to have a choke point here, but I feel like maybe this is a little bit too aggro if I'm also going to be putting resources here. Alternatively, we can keep this the way it is and have the player choose, do they want to engage with the choke point and make it so that they're reducing the value of the enemy taking the middle area with the rocky ground? Or do we want to make the player choose to consolidate their defense force along an expansion along this water over here? And I think that would be the superior option. It still has some gameplay flow issues if we keep this ramp the way that it is, because when you're going to this ramp, if you have to walk through one of your expansions to get here, or you have to walk through an enemy's expansion to go from here to the enemy's base, that obviously is going to interrupt pathing quite a bit. And also, I didn't realize this at the time, but if you look at this from a more global scope, we can say, coming out from this particular ramp is quite powerful, actually, for whoever's coming down here, and it's quite easy to get access to it as well. If you imagine having a base here, you can essentially sidestep the expansion, go straight to the main, or indeed attack the expansion directly without any hope of reprisal from the opposing player, if you're able to take this area. And there's not really a whole lot that they can do about it to stop you from taking this area. So to that end, I'm going to move the ramp over a little bit to the left and refactor some of that cliff. And once that's done, I'm going to actually place the resources along that ridge. And maybe after all of that, another thing I'll do is either move the main natural, or the main resources, we'll say, to displace them further away from these siege cliffs, or tuck those siege cliffs in a little bit more. Still not 100% sure what I want to do about that. I have a feeling it'll be moving the main resources so that if you do decide to build over there, you can still get punished, but you can also benefit from taking the area, and we keep this amount of build space and mobility in the general vicinity of this map, because I don't feel like the answer is to add more negative space than we already have. The other thing that I might muck about with is this high dirt over here that's bordering on the cliffs. I feel like it does serve a really good purpose of choking out ground units that are trying to approach from the middle of the map, we'll say, but I'm not 100% sure if it should be just completely inaccessible from land. And if I try to expand it a little bit to make a ramp make sense there, we'll lose some of the visual flair, and we'll also make it so that it's even more of a choke in that sense. So I don't know how to feel about that just yet, but it is something that I'm considering. I also feel like maybe it would be too powerful when used with dropships or something like that, right? Trojans, any sort of transport in general, would definitely take this ground and probably never give it back if there was no ramp up here. So there's some more things for me to think about there, but for the most part, I know what I'm doing with this particular area. It's time to get to work. Okay, so we've managed to make the changes that we wanted to make here in this particular area of the map, and of course, conversely, in the symmetrically identical area of the map. Obviously, I have not bothered with anything related to here. I didn't want to mess around with the very small choke that this represents, and obviously, I wanted ground units to still be able to actually have some relevance, so to speak. One thing I might consider is providing a north-facing ramp that you can use to make moves, but I feel like this ramp by itself is so small that it would not be advisable to actually path armies through here, and this might even lead to more pathing issues than it actually resolves in theory. So while it's a good meaning change, I probably won't bother with it in this particular map. That being said, I do feel like our changes to the raised jungle worked out really well, because if you consider the initial complaint, which was that it was too easy to leverage this position against this player, now it's still possible to leverage this position because of the fact that if you look at this area, it's obviously pretty powerful. If you just sit here and benefit from the height advantage, you can start taking pot shots down here. We might recede this a little bit the more I think about the strength of this particular area, so that fewer kinds of units can benefit. But obviously, while this little bit here that impedes some movement, and this bit here as well that serves to start to create a choke point, it will definitely help units that are directly attacking. There is still a benefit to coming here. I didn't want to remove all the utility of coming up to the raised jungle and then using that as a way to take this particular base, because again, this base is higher value. It's meant to be more important, and to that extent, I'll do something even crazier than you thought. That's right, 3 geysers, because 2 of them are actually up here where they can be easily harassed. If you're able to take this base, I think you should be able to reap the rewards, so to speak. Now, the other thing that I think was a false assumption on my part initially is that these corner areas of the map were actually going to be very important or very easy to hold on to, or any of those things. I think right now in the current rendition of the map, they're too far away to see too much utility. I suppose what this does allow for is that interesting dynamic I talked about in the very first section of recording, where I talked about how Red might decide to take his natural and then the corner base up here as a third, and then use this as an opportunity to essentially take the whole top half of the map. Because if you can hold this control, then you could probably hold this pretty easily and then just try to choke out your opponent over here. And they can do the same thing by taking their natural and then their third up here in the corner, and then this would be a logical base as well to take. That being said, I don't know if that's a realistic proposition in this case. I'm not 100% sure if it makes the most sense, shall we say, to run this particular gamut, right? Run this particular risk of taking the top half versus taking, your left hemisphere. So I'm not 100% sure if that really makes any sense. I think it will hinge on how I incorporate the corner bases into the overall experience of playing the map. And I'm not 100% sure that I can promise that the map will work out very well either in that particular sense. I do feel like maybe that's a core issue, is how far away a base would be, unless I maybe put it along this ridge, and even then it's still quite far. So a thought that did occur to me is to put it on the raised jungle, but I want to maintain the raised jungle as a pathway specifically, and you go up the ramp in order to access another base. And maybe I just make it incredibly high value in terms of having like fucking 4 geysers or something insane. Maybe I have a ton of mineral fields or something, so that it's a different flavor of resource that you're getting. I'm not 100% sure what the solution to that would be theoretically. I really like conceptually the fact that you go, up to go down to go up over here with this little ramp compound that we have going on. I feel like maybe if that overlooked a base similar to my Kakadu Port 3v3 map, that might actually work quite well. Unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure how I would incorporate a base into this. I mean, I could remove this ramp, tuck this whole thing in, create a base, but it would be very small on build space, which is one area where maybe it makes sense to take this area just because of the build space you are afforded by virtue of doing that. Maybe that's one of the things that this base offers that other bases don't, is a sheer, very high amount of build space in that respect. So I think I will still stick with it in the interest of time as well, because of course I have been working on this map for 3 sessions so far. So I would like to complete it in this session, even if maybe just the draft isn't really that great and I need to make some changes. That can be part of the experience of putting the map together. In fact, something that I should probably have mentioned in greater detail earlier on is that mapping is really all about iteration in many respects, specifically working on a map. I mean, a map can go through many iterations. You saw what happened with the Temple Cliff over here, where I finally changed it yet again after I already had changing it once or twice in the previous episodes. And obviously what happened with the raised jungle being converted from high dirt to raised jungle, and then adding the high dirt back onto it afterwards. And then obviously this whole area where originally the expansion was going to be here, but then I decided to, in the interest of build space, all that stuff. There's so many different things that change with iteration, either because you tested it or because you thought about it and something different happened in that respect. So it's really important that we keep our heads on in that respect. Don't worry too much about making it perfect the first time around. And while I'm not sure, I have reservations about whether or not a high ground base in this context would be massively impactful or even hold a huge amount of value, I don't want to shy away from it. I'm going to stick to the plan. We're going to see how it plays out in an AI test, maybe do a test ourselves later on off recording. I'll talk about my general impressions of the map later on. Let's get into the final stage of map development, where I will be placing corners for raised jungle and additionally tackling this last base to make. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what I just did. So obviously I added a little bit of a higher terrain cliff to clip off the upper and lowermost corners of the area. It's going to be the same thing as the high temple over here, essentially. It's adding a little bit of curvature, but mostly it's kind of naturally guiding the player away from these hard edges where two corners meet each other, or two edges meet each other to form a corner in the first place. So I'll actually add this temple a little bit just in a moment. But one of the things that I was able to get accomplished here is have a more unique base layout than what you normally see out of these minerals, and obviously have another base that has 2 gas, but also allow for attacks up to be a little bit more deadly up the straight and narrow path, so that you still have a threat, even if you do decide to take this from a much farther away reinforcing angle. Looking at this now, I'll actually very likely move this ramp like so. We'll say, we'll go there, and then we'll do this. Because I feel like looking at this now, it doesn't really make a massive amount of sense to keep it, essentially come up the ramp and then be bombarded directly into a edge of the map. So we're going to do the same thing over here. All right, we just spent a little bit of time making that a bit prettier in general. And aside from that, I think our work here is done. I'm going to handle the temple cliffs and the corners for raised jungle, because Blizzard decided not to ship that tile with corners for some reason. And then we're going to do the triggers. But again, brief estimation of what I was able to accomplish here. We've now got a slightly easier access way from the red side to the top right and from the blue side to the bottom left. We also have high value entrance over here that you can guard easily if you decide to commit forces to it, but obviously can be used to overwhelm you from the ground. And we also have a high value expansion, medium value, I guess, compared to everything else. It's higher value than the main, which is actually kind of rare. It's rare to see the main have the least amount of resource value. I think it probably has the most build space value, so there is that. And obviously it is at a very advantaged position in terms of like parlaying into other areas of the map. So we'll see how that evolves over time. I think one last thing that I will do is move these resource areas closer so that everything is within spitting distance of each other. It does look a little bit less natural, but it will be healthier for the gameplay, we'll say. So yeah, let's get to the prettying up phase and get into game. All right, it's time to get into game. We're going to set up the AI, of course, and then we're going to see how the map plays. To set up the AI, at least for Cosmonarchy, it's rather trivial. I'm going to set up 3 locations, and then I'm going to make the triggers themselves. In order to access locations, you hit Control-L on your keyboard. There's also this drop-down menu you can hit to select locations manually. And it doesn't really matter where we put these locations. I'll just leave them in the top left-hand corner. You obviously click and drag to create the location. By default, you're probably going to snap to a grid, or maybe they'll snap anyway. You can turn that off with locations snap to active grid, which is what I use. I also turn off clip names so that if like the location is really small, you'll still get something, usually, anyway. So then we're going to go into triggers, because all we need to do was place those locations. We'll go to triggers, classic map triggers. I'll also hit Control-Shift-T, which is what I normally do. These were created by default, one of them for observers and one of them for actual players. We're going to hit New and create a trigger for Force 1. And we'll say, go into conditions, we'll say bring. We'll change player 1 to current player, which means that it'll run for any player that is in Force 1 anyway. We'll say at least, yeah, that's fine. 1, Terran Command Center to anywhere. Anywhere is an invisible location that it covers the entire map, basically. So this trigger will run if its conditions are met, and obviously the conditions here are current player brings at least 1 command center anywhere. Now we're going to go to Actions, hit New, and we're going to type R in this menu after selecting it to access the R fields, basically. We'll just hit R a few times and we'll see Run AI script at location. So this is one of the trigger actions that we want, so keep this in mind. And what we'll do is I believe it's expansion. Oh, no, it's the other way around. Terran expansion custom level, because it's a Terran script if it has a command center. And we will run that on location 1. However, location 1's obviously in the top left-hand corner. We need it to run at the start location. So what we'll do instead is hit O for order and then scroll up to move location. You can also just go there manually, obviously. And we're going to center location labeled location 1 on Terran Command Center. Hey, it auto-filled it for us for owned by current player. And we'll say at anywhere. And we'll obviously move this above the run script thing. So with this trigger, it will first center location 1 onto the command center and then execute the AI script, which is exactly what we want. Now, this is all we need to do because it's set to, well, we have to change this to 100 ore for Cosmonarchy. But if you're just using vanilla rules, it'll be 50. But this is actually all we need for running a Terran script for any player that happens to be playing. And this is a scalable solution for 8 players, 6 players, however many players you have in your map. You just run this trigger once, and obviously the other thing is you don't even need to do preserve trigger or anything because it runs independently for every player in the Force. So as long as they're in Force 1, this trigger will run a script for the Terran player. We need to copy it, and we're going to make a change. Obviously, copy with Control, or just with C. Delete is D. Moving up and down is really goofy. It's like O is U to go up and O to go down. You can see it highlighted over here. So now we're going to jump into this. Instead of Terran Command Center, we'll do Protoss Nexus. And we will move location 2 on Protoss Nexus, on my current player at anywhere. Location 2 is the location we're running our script at, and we'll do Protoss expansion custom level. And then we're going to make another copy and do one for Zerg here. Zerg Hatchery is the structure we want. We'll set location 3 on Zerg Hatchery. And Zerg expansion custom level, run it at location 3. And there you go. Now our AI should work out just fine. If we wanted to confirm that, one thing that we could do is we could double click to open up the action for modifying resources, since its condition is always. And what we can do is we can set deaths for current player, set to 1, start location. And this is Cosmonarchy only, I should mention. But as long as this trigger is happening before the script triggers, we'll be setting a debug variable, essentially a verbose variable you could quantify it as, and this will cause the AI to print a message indicating their build order and their personality, at least in Cosmonarchy. Again, this is specific to that game state. So now we can close, Control-S to save, and our map is officially ready to go. The only thing I will change is going into the map descriptions, which you can access by hitting Control-Enter. You can also go to Scenario and map properties. So control, wait, it is just control enter. I don't know why it says control shift enter. Maybe that also works. Either way, both of them work. So we're going to set our player 1 and player 2 to computer. We could also do something that I like to do. We like to call it the single player allower, the SP allower, by setting one of the observer slots to computer and then setting their race to Protoss. I just for shits and giggles, I like to set all of the observers to yellow Protoss because I imagine that they're just a literal witness or something from the, like an observer, like a Protoss. You know what I mean? So we'll say Protoss, 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 Protoss. We'll keep everybody else as human user select, the actual player. And obviously we gotta put the name of our map in here, so it's the Underwood. And we gotta come up with a description for the Underwood. And that's my description. So we're gonna jump in here and name this Crow and Frog. And we'll move the observers, the other non-combatants into the observer slots. We will untick randomized start location for all players, well, forces that have players. And we will also place start locations for the observers. So in this case, I only need one start location for me. So I will place him right there. And I guess I'll place one for symmetry's sake down there. One thing I forget to do here and have to do later on is obviously set that fourth player who owns that start location I just placed in the bottom left-hand side to computer and sort them into a different force so that I can actually facilitate a single-player launch of the game and use map settings. Unfortunately, we haven't found a way to circumvent this limitation as of the time of recording. Hopefully that changes very soon. Go ahead and save. Now we are finally ready to jump into the map and see how it goes. Okay, we are now ready to get into the map. We've got our single player allower computer. We've got Crow and Frog. Let's see who wins, Crow or Frog. I don't decide, but somebody will. Now, as we get into this, one of the things we should note is, of course, that I am going to be running the AI debug plugin, which is available, but by default commented out in the Cosmonarchy game state. And obviously that's something that you'll have to bear in mind. If you want to debug the AI yourself in some way or for some reason, you would just have to remove the underscore in the file name. So just some trivia for you. It's not really related to mapping necessarily. Now, the AI debug plugin allows me to skip ahead a little bit. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I see we've got actually an interesting opener. One of the few Zerg openers that opts to not expand before getting its tech. So we might actually see a very quick rush, which is an exciting prospect. We'll see how it pans out. So yeah, the attack force for both of these players should actually be popping out maybe relatively at the same time, and we do indeed have our first expansion. It's kind of funny that both players expanded a little bit late, at least for Cosmonarchy AI standards. 2 minutes and 30 seconds is pretty late. Remember that when you're speeding up with the debug plugin, your UI doesn't update, so you have to do that a few times. Now, the AI isn't going to use all of the elements of your map that you end up putting together. For example, they're not going to necessarily position units above this ramp here. We haven't added the technology for that. And if you're using default AI instead of Cosmonarchy AI, because you're not using the Cosmonarchy game state, then that's going to be even more pronounced, where the AI isn't even going to bother trying to do simple things like kiting. Well, I say simple, but obviously that's almost a bit facetious. It looks like this AI was actually planning on taking the 3 gas base right next, but obviously they're kind of low on cash right now. They have rebuilt the Excision now. Some Droleths have been scattered around, and they're finally morphing those into larval colonies. The Shaman finally goes down after being chased halfway across the map and getting very important information that the AI already had because it map hacks. And yeah, I mean, it's not like the AI reacts to whatever it finds anyway. We got some Iron Foundries coming out. We're going to start seeing those tier 3 mech units at the very least, if not in addition to some guild halls or whatever. And while we do have some interesting interactions happening over here with like Nidus canals and stuff, and this third base is going down, and we do have tier 3 tech for the Zerg, you still have to wonder if it's not too late, right? So he has been able to harass some of the workers down over here. Of course, I still don't have a Mason corpse just yet, so perhaps understandably, this is hilarious. You know, with all these idle workers, you'd almost think that the AI was a real player. I do like that he's continually expanding his territory with creep and stuff like that. That certainly feels Zergy. We do finally have this base being taken. Still nothing doing over here. This Terran player not interested at all in this right now. He's too busy spamming out units, probably. He is finally taking the space. That was a juicy laser stage. Looks like the attack force is finally moving. He is shuffling a number of units over here trying to defend against that attack that's incoming. This is actually the first decisive blow that we've seen in quite a while coming out from either player. And even this, it's mostly been grinding through some of the static defense and antagonizing the Zerg into producing additional units. So we'll have to see if those Heracles can pop those Nathakor swarms. It's not looking too likely just yet. Well, they do have a good stack of maybe 4 or 5 of them over here now. They are actually chewing through them. So that's the AoE that we wanted to see. These units really should be joining in with the fight. Hey guys, there's a battle going on over here. Yeah, it looks like, especially with any reinforcements that might show up, this base should be toast. We've chewed through quite a few units already. And hey, we actually have some Liberal Pond. That's neat. So I think that test was pretty successful, and we've probably seen enough by now. So what we're going to do is release this map in the next Cosmonarchy patch. We'll leave it as it is. Maybe we'll pretty it up in a later stage, but I think it's served its purpose as an introductory map. It's nothing spectacularly fancy. It's nothing high concept. The most interesting aspect about it for my money is the fact that you get to move either hemispheres left to right, or you get to separate the map north to south. You kind of get a bit of a choice. Maybe, ideally, obviously, you would like to do both. And the opportunity is there if you're quite successful at grinding down your opponent. And the distances aren't that small so as to shall we say, reduce the efficacy of rushes. You obviously have the opportunity to go straight from spawn to spawn with air units as well. So there's a lot of potential with the map in general. And I liked that I was seeing a lot of interaction between the different AI players, especially in the early stages of the game where they had their opening attacks kind of go around each other in order to access their own bases and stuff, right? And there's some dynamics. And yeah, the AI play goofy. That's just how the AI do. But I do like what I saw in general. And I think we can optimize this concept a little bit. There's not too few build space areas here and there. Yeah, you could have more build space as a general rule, and you could probably have more resources, a bigger map, and that sort of thing. But once you get past this map size, I think you start thinking about expanding the player count as well. So, like I said, the map will be available for Cosmonarchy players if you feel like downloading it and checking it out for yourself, running a couple of games on it, whatever. But the main takeaway that I have so far is that it's a compelling core concept. It's nothing spectacularly fancy, and we were able to get it done in just 3 sessions, which is 3. So I hope you learned something from this particular video. And again, the process of mapping is very iterative. It takes a while to get yourself situated and feel like you really figured out something. So hopefully you take it with a grain of salt. You're able to move through the phases of mapping and come up with a concept, block it out, and then add some custom terrain or add some doodads or whatever the case may be. The important point to stress is figuring out functionality as well as figuring out what you want. If you want a lower tier map, a map with tier 1 tech being almost the mainstay, then yeah, you probably do want to have lower gas counts, maybe even lower mineral counts overall. If you want a more long-term game, you want safer expansions with more gases. You want the opportunity to fight over even higher value bases, which I kind of married both of those approaches here, with the mains being kind of low value in terms of resources, but the expansions all having more than one gas, and some of the bases having significantly more minerals as well. I think I was able to come up with an interesting cross-section of different styles and different flavors, and I think playstyle has its own room here. I think your players can express their personality in different ways because the map doesn't prohibit any given strategy necessarily. So while I'm not 100% sure about certain decisions and certain areas of the layout, I do think overall it's an okay map, and I'm glad to have been able to make it in the first place, hopefully to educate you guys on what would go into making your own okay maps, shall we say. So I'll leave it there, and of course there'll be more videos in this series as time progresses, so stay tuned, you can stay subscribed or whatever other YouTubers say, and I'll just catch you next time.